Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor of Town Hall, and today I'm joined by...
Niraj Chokshi. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Niraj. I would encourage everyone to go and follow Niraj's work at GovBeat at the Washington Post, but I brought him on because there are a couple different topics right now, and he covers a lot of state-based policy. And there are a couple topics that are pretty hot in Washington, but the major policy work is being done at the state level right now. So first off, President Obama has been pushing for a while and reemphasized this in the State of the Union address that he has made a legislative priority to try and hike the federal minimum wage, which would mean a lot in some states that don't have an additional state minimum wage. But there are a lot of different state and local initiatives to hike the minimum wage, and I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how those are going forward and how, the parties in local states are taking their cues from D.C. on some of these issues.
It's very clearly something that a lot of people are concerned about. I don't know that I would argue. I don't know that I would say that the parties are really taking cues all that closely from DC, because I think a lot of this is actual, sort of grassroots momentum. There are a lot of people. It hasn't been raised in a few years. There are a lot of people, I think, who genuinely feel like it's overdue, and it's time to get it up. So, but yeah, I mean, there is some bipartisan support there. Even national polls show that minimum wage has, I think in the 60s%, and even among Republicans, I think a majority is at least open to the idea.
Right. It certainly seems to be a winning issue when it comes to polling numbers. And I actually did want to hit on this because, I mean, being in DC and someone who focuses way more on national politics, to me, it does seem like kind of the party structures are taking their cues from DC. But I wanted to get your take, because obviously you're a lot more into some of these state initiatives. There have been minimum wage hikes in various states across time, and it's just my kind of Beltway insider perspective that it seems like interest spikes when DC's interest spikes.
Yeah.
Do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I think that is true. There's a sort of bully pulpit effect, as there is with anything. Once the president starts talking about something, people start to think about it too. I think while the parties may not be as much of a driving force, obviously they're involved. Obviously, they want to see it federally, so Democrats aren't going to discourage state efforts. But I think some of the interests that are more coordinated are unions. We saw that in Seattle in Seatac, which is sort of the area right near Seattle Airport, where they just barely voted for a $15 minimum wage last November. So I would say that it's definitely fair to say that interests like unions are definitely trying to coordinate. I know there have been a couple now in the past year, a couple of major national protests of fast food workers. And they've been, those strikes have been huge, and they've been coordinated at a national level. So,
yeah, I wanted the Seatac minimum wage hike. Do you think that is maybe one of the most interesting things going on at the state or local level right now? I mean, the $15 minimum wage is more than double what the federal minimum wage is right now, and $15 is something that seems like it might provide a natural economic experiment, because a lot of economists are kind of split on the question of if the minimum wage creates more unemployment than there would be at lower levels. Do you find that to be maybe the most radical proposal that's been put into effect in the last few years?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we've looked into this, and I don't think there's a minimum wage higher anywhere else, and I think it's the highest by a few dollars. And for I may be wrong about that. It's hard to keep track of every local minimum wage, but that is our understanding. And I think you're right. To some extent, it will be a bit of a test. We can kind of see if unemployment goes up. The problem is that a lot of the workers there are or it's all union, and it's all through the airport. And so,
Mm.
as much as the airport may want to lay people off because they can't afford those employees, at some point it needs a base minimum. I think it's sort of tough because for the same reason, a few Berkeley professors recently put out a book actually on San Francisco and kind of looking at the past decade and a half of San Francisco's liberal labor laws. They found that they had no major effect on unemployment, but again, the problem is, this is sort of a unique place. San Francisco, being in Silicon Valley, it almost seems like you could do no wrong with
Right.
policies out there. So I think what's more interesting is seeing the state variation, which may not exist for long. I mean, if the federal government is able to, which seems unlikely, raise the minimum wage, then all the states will kind of be at a new minimum. But I think state minimum wages are probably the better experiment because there's a little bit more of the comparison's a little easier, and you're not limited by some very unique circumstances.
Yeah, that's interesting. Especially that I didn't know that the Seatac minimum wage is in an area where it is, like you said, mostly, I guess, unionized employees. And unionized employees, kind of as a rule, have higher average wages than similarly skilled positions that are non-unionized, right?
Right.
Wages and compensation. So I guess if you're in an area where that kind of a minimum wage hike would be largely symbolic, you're not going to get that kind of experiment, right?
Right. Exactly.
And I hadn't actually seen I don't think that I've read the new San Francisco research, but obviously that's a unique area as well, and it does seem like some of the municipalities, states, whatever, that push higher minimum wage laws usually have kind of higher skilled workers that are already working at higher wages, right?
Sorry, say that again.
The places that have higher minimum wage laws and are pushing higher minimum wage laws are generally blue states, right?
Right. Right.
And my impression is that blue states generally have higher skilled workers across the board than red states, right? And the average wages in those states might already be higher and would be easier to absorb the economic effects, if there are any, of those higher minimum wage hikes, right?
Right. I would assume that's true. I haven't done the comparison myself, but that sounds right to me from everything that I know and read.
Mm-hmm. Now, how do you I guess see, because I think that the labor unions aspect is definitely an interesting part of this, and they've been involved in this fight for, I mean, basically perpetually, right? Like
Yeah.
kind of a pretty standard agenda for labor unions are higher wages, more benefits,
Sure.
things like that. Have they seen an increase in, I guess, state-based organization, even in an kind of an atmosphere where a lot of the push is going to the federal level right now?
You mean have they focused more on the states rather than the federal government?
Yeah.
I don't know that I have heard it from them, but I mean, I think it seems pretty clear to me that is the case. I mean, just judging from sort of the from the nationally coordinated strikes, but those are all focused on the local policies. I think just reading every day, we read all the local papers and we see a lot of local coordination, a lot of local op-eds, all that kind of stuff. It seems like that is what's going on, and I mean that's sort of an operating principle of our blog. It was why GovBeat was created, and I think it's true of a lot of different policies that people recognize that it's a lot easier to get 50 state laws passed than it is to get one federal law passed in a lot of cases. So.
Yeah, that isn't actually really interesting, especially in an era of pretty intensely divided government,
right,
like we have now. It seems like there's a lot more room at the state level to get some of these initiatives passed
right.
on kind of a state by state basis.
And the other thing too, I think that people don't appreciate is that getting dozens of states to pass a policy is a lot stickier than getting the federal government to pass a policy, because one federal law can be undone pretty easily. But to undo a minimum wage hike in 30 different states requires basically 30 different fights.
Right.
And I mean, they're cheaper and they're smaller and they're easier to focus on. But for an organization that, I mean, what organization is gonna go out of its way to try to undo dozens of different policies?
I'd say a fair number.
That's true, but I think
Americans for Prosperity or
right.
ALEC or organization. I mean, generally
Sure,
conservative organizations like that, and those do have fairly large grassroots contingencies.
Yeah, well, and I think they also they understand it from their end of things too. That is for the same reason. ALEC, for example, I think that they have been so successful in large part because they've always focused on states and they've always focused
right.
on getting these policies in place. And when you have dozens of different policies that are pro free market, it's really difficult for liberals to undo that.
Right. I think it's particularly interesting, and this might just be a unique condition of the political times we're living in, but you take some of these issues that are very broadly supported popularly, but are not very high intensive among those supporters. And it is easier to move them through states where you have more unified governments, right? So we might be seeing this with the minimum wage fight, but we saw it with post Sandy Hook gun legislation, right? There was 90% people polled would tell pollsters they're in favor of background checks, whatever interpretation they have of that background checks. But generally, you got larger numbers in favor of stricter gun legislation, in massive numbers, right? And there was no movement at the federal level because you had a very intense, a very passionate opposition, whereas you had a very, very supportive but very dispassionate coalition in favor of that. But we did see more gun safety legislation passed in places like Colorado and Connecticut in the wake of some of these gun tragedies, because you had less of those intense supporters. And I feel like that's something that we might be seeing with the minimum wage, right? The minimum wage hikes do enjoy broad popular and bipartisan support.
Right.
But that bipartisan support isn't particularly intense. It's not a high priority for most voters. So at the national level, you can ignore the kind of broad populism in favor of very intense opposition, whereas in a state like Washington State, the number of people intensely opposed to the minimum wage is basically zero, even if the supporters aren't that passionate.
Right. I mean, and I think that's right. For all the problems there are the federal government, a lot of state governments have the opposite issue, which is that 37 of them are under unified party control, which means as long as it's not something that's too controversial, if it's a classic liberal policy, it's easy to get through. If it's a classic conservative policy, it's easy to get through. And so I think you're totally right on that. I mean, I think you're right about the intensity point too. Is that the opposition just doesn't. The opposition in a lot of instances isn't there or isn't as loud, and when it is, it's usually railing against a single party that's in control of everything from the state house, the state senate, to the governor's mansion.
Right, yeah, and I wonder if that's kind of a unique aspect of like I said, the political climate, because we have such intense divisions at the federal level. If states might be the places where we're seeing a lot more of these policies play out.
Yeah, no, and that's totally true, and that's totally what's going on. I mean, and we see it with all kinds of policies, not just minimum wage. I mean, we're seeing it with tons of labor policies. North Carolina, I think, is like the perfect conservative example. They cut off long-term unemployment benefits well before the federal government let them expire. It's just it's just a lot easier to get things done at the state level.
Right. And I do think that's why, a lot of your work is interesting, because we've seen, I guess, states kind of stratify in a partisan way. So you're seeing, and this has kind of been a conservative trope for years, is you're seeing, a largely blue California passing largely blue policies versus a largely red Texas passing largely red policies. And I know conservatives have for a long time set that particular clash up as, we love Texas and we hate California. And kind of at the federal level, at least in the Obama years, but probably divisions that started long before that, we've just seen, intensity of those divisions. So we're seeing kind of only the broadest based possible major legislation can get through, at least since Republicans took control of the House.
Right, and I think that's an important point, is that the states are polarizing too, and have been for a while. My colleagues at the Monkey Cage blog, I maybe a month ago, did a study or highlighted a study that looked at state polarization, and I think it was more than half or around half of the states were more polarized than Congress. So state legislatures were more polarized than Congress, and the other half, I think, though they were less polarized, they were a little closer to Congress than the ones that were more polarized than Congress was. So it's definitely the case. Excuse me.
I don't know how much research you've done into this particular question, but do you know if that polarization is due to kind of mobility stratification? Like, are people moving to states in a partisan way, or are people who are currently living in those states just adopting more partisan views? I just wonder, like, how mobility plays into that question, because we've seen the worry of mobility hit all over the place. The people in the Rust Belt moving to the Sun Belt and Detroit and all of those issues.
Right. That's a really great question. I haven't looked into it that much. I would suspect. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if you in an age where telework is a lot more possible, where moving in general is a lot easier, where people are more open to it, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's contributing to it.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I wonder if geographic mobility, how much geographic mobility is playing into that. I wanted to move on now to our second topic, which is another kind of state-by-state issue that we're seeing come along, and that's marijuana legalization, where we've seen, or decriminalization, where we've seen, people talked about it during Super Bowl week, that Washington State and Colorado have largely legalized possession and consumption of marijuana. And last week, Texas Governor Rick Perry, someone who people would not think of as a liberal in any sense of the word in the culture war, said that he would not be opposed to decriminalization laws in Texas. So this is, but at the same time, kind of going back to this, I don't think that we're going to see any movement on decriminalization laws at the federal level. So do you see kind of movement on decriminalization and legalization laws at the state level maybe sweeping the nation in the next few years?
Yeah, I do, and I think the pro sort of legalization groups, they're really closely watching this. They're really closely pushing it. They're very involved. Right now we've got Alaska this August is expected to vote on it in a ballot measure, and the latest polling, I don't know where it stands. The latest polling is a little old, but they tried it a decade ago. It didn't work, but it wasn't super far apart, and if it's following national trends at all, it could very well be legalized by August, or in August.
Now, is that legalization in the kind of Colorado and Washington sense, or is that just going to be decriminalization?
That's legalization.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's more of these. It's less of kind of the traditional East Coast liberal states that have had these pushes recently, and it's more of the kind of frontier states, the Colorados and the Alaskas like that. And so this to me seems to be less of a strictly partisan issue and more of an apolitical cultural issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the best guide for any policy, I think the best guide is what the groups that want to see it happen, where they're focused. And if you look at the states where the pro legalization groups are focused, they cite Alaska, Oregon, but Arizona too, which isn't, it's not a liberal state.
Right.
California,
Yeah.
Maine, Massachusetts, those are some perhaps not surprising ones, but Montana, Nevada, and then, I
Right.
mean, yeah, I mean, it's obviously a lot of the states too. I mean, I think that they're targeting pretty much all of New England as well, but there are definitely some states in there that you would not guess would be the ones that it could pass in. But to them, that's where they're placing their bets. So
Yeah. And I remember, I guess, throughout the 2000s, we saw this kind of movement that not portray it, but it was this kind of media phenomenon portraying the rise of the libertarian Mountain West,
right,
which, I am very, skeptical of a lot of people who push libertarianism as a motivating political force in America. But it does seem that some of those attitudes are actually there with, like I said, some of these frontier states. And it seems like the further west you go, the more open to some of these divisive cultural issues people are.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? I think there's always been this sort of some anti-federalism out there, and probably not probably not totally unfounded. If you look at a map of federally owned land across the country, you see that 90% of it is in western states, and some of those states, I think New Mexico is like 80% federal land. And I bring that up basically because I think that sort of gets at this attitude that the federal government has been interfering and has been involved with these places that couldn't feel further from DC
Right.
for decades and centuries, and so yeah, so it's not totally unnatural for them to be annoyed that the federal government is trying to tell them what they can and can't smoke.
That actually is really interesting to me. You're
Yeah.
you're saying that some of the like southwestern and mountain west states that have these massive tracts of federal land resent the fact that so much of their land is under federal control, and that kind of is driving some of these attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would say that that's exactly why, but I think it's sort of I'm sure it's a contributing factor. I mean, I think it's just it's this extension of what is the government doing? Why is the government so involved in my life? Like, why are they here? And yeah, I just pulled up a story I wrote from October. More than half of the West is federally owned, and there's a push in a lot of those states to get it back. And some people argue that the push is basically just so they can mine the resources there and stop making it public land. But for whatever the reason is, the lawmakers out there want it. In Utah, for example, they passed a law. I mean, it's toothless because it's unconstitutional because they can't reclaim federal land. But they passed a law. I think it was last year or maybe the year before, basically giving the federal government a deadline to return the land to them.
I know.
Yeah.
It feels like laws like that like you said are completely toothless. Measuring some of those laws is an interesting way of kind of gouging the political culture of a state. I remember in the Bush years, Vermont would pass these war crimes resolutions against George W. Bush, and that was kind of obviously completely unenforceable, meaningless, et cetera, but a fairly large barometer of the political culture of the state of Vermont. And I feel like some of these meaningless resolutions, and you see them in the Obama years. You see some of the southern states passing pseudo nullification laws, or at least bringing them up. I don't remember exactly how, but I remember one of the Carolinas tried to pass we won't have an individual mandate here law, which is obviously it was a pseudo nullification law, and completely unenforceable, but largely symbolic of the culture there. So I hadn't thought about the anti-federal lands laws going on in New Mexico and Utah, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I see these, especially votes on issues that don't have the force of law. I think are sort of the ideal kind of survey of a state, right? Because people generally will vote, the way the constituents want them to vote, and especially when there's no impact to what they're voting on. They're really it's a show vote, and that's the point. And so to me, I mean, I see that as a representative poll of sort of state
Right.
attitudes. So yeah.
Do some of these show votes, are they actually like all that publicized or popular in these states? Like, are the newspapers covering them? Is the media covering them? Are these things that do actually permeate the consciousness of the residents of these states?
I think so. At least on this issue, yeah. I know that in Utah, the Attorney General has written at least one op-ed about it. I think a couple. I want to say a couple. During when the federal government shut down, he jumped at the opportunity to write an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune, basically saying, give it back to us. We can manage it better than you guys can.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and judging from the way those stories about those kinds of votes are played on their websites and in their papers, it seems like it's getting out to the readership.
That's really interesting. Now, do you kind of along those lines, do you see this, I guess, frustration with Washington leading to more, uh, I guess, passion for state-based politics?
That's interesting. That's sort of hard. It's hard to say whether it's sort of the hatred for Washington creating it, or whether it's the fact that because Washington's getting nothing done and states are doing things, it's sort of it's more natural to care about it. I found myself included, a few years ago, I didn't follow what was going on in the states as closely as I do now, and part of that is because I think the interesting stuff was being done at the federal level. And that's not, I mean, obviously that's an overstatement, but I think to some degree, I mean, states are doing much more innovative things now because the federal government isn't really there for them. And whether that's on economic policies, liberal or conservative, they're testing out new things. But yeah, I mean, I think whether it's sort of a chicken or the egg thing, but for sure, I think people are definitely focused more on it. It seems like there's a lot more passion, and it makes sense because they're voting on very serious things like abortion bans or uh, you know whether or not to expand Medicaid. I mean, these are things that affect a lot of
Right.
people.
Yeah. Um, it's almost, I guess, so conservatives generally, I think, are more tolerant and maybe even enthusiastic about gridlock at the federal level. And that seems to me to kind of foster this environment that we have now where a lot of major issues are being done at the state level that have traditionally been federal priorities like the minimum wage, and that seems to foster this environment of what conservatives like to harken back to, the idea of laboratories of democracy, right? So we can say that if you want and support marijuana legalization, move your family to Washington or Colorado and live under the laws that you want. And I think that would be very interesting to look at. What we were talking about before is has I guess geographic mobility increased in an age of increasing partisan divide in the states, and that would be a really interesting kind of reinforcement for the conservative idea that people should just move to where they want, under whose laws they want to live in, right?
Right. And you're definitely seeing that with marijuana laws. There are a lot of families. There's some rare disorders among kids where basically they have these incredible seizures. And I think actually we ran a story recently on one family from Maryland that was considering moving to Colorado because the only thing that people know works is marijuana. Obviously, mild doses, and the kids aren't smoking it, but like feeding them edibles that have been cooked with marijuana has proven to help prevent these crazy seizures. And in that example, I mean, the kid, every time he had a seizure, he had to be hospitalized, and he would have one every couple of days, and I mean, it was just totally debilitating. So yeah, and they're not the only ones. There are a lot of families with young kids who are considering moving to Colorado for that reason. So I totally don't think it's out of the question that people are moving. I mean, that's obviously an extreme case, but I'm sure there are examples of people who are who'd rather kind of do things above board and are trying to
Right.
find a way out to Colorado or Washington to do it. So
In cases like extreme cases like that you mentioned, that would make complete sense. And we heard obviously a lot about marijuana tourism recently. You wonder if it changes from marijuana tourism to marijuana residency.
right,
Um, but you don't hear all that much about people moving for minimum wage laws. Probably largely because people who would benefit from minimum wage laws don't have the means to move.
right,
That a family that's established in Maryland
sure,
does.
yeah.
So it would be interesting to see which things are motivating people to make those kinds of moves.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, these things are also moving quickly, though. So I mean, we, on January 1st, we had our first 2 states with legalization. I mean, if things move, quickly over the next few years, it could spread pretty fast. And if that happens, I think it's sort of similar to gay marriage, where people can't just up and leave right away, right? So I mean, they might just wait it
Right.
out, and maybe it'll come to their state if they're patient.
Right.
Hawaii, for example, is another state that pro legalization folks think they can turn toward legalization, and it's far away, but like maybe it could happen in a couple of years.
Right. Yeah. All right. I think that's all we have for today. Thanks a lot
Cool.
for joining me today, Troy.
No problem.
And I will see everyone next time on another episode of Vlogging Heads.
Thank you.